when times are difficult, we look to see who we can blame, who the other is. Um, that's where you see also not just anti Semitism, but really bigotry against any group.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Interview from TheLine.Info. Today we are joined by Rabbi Samuel Spector from the Congregation Kol Ami here in Salt Lake City, Utah, to discuss the roots of anti-Semitism and go in depth to examine its presence in our society and how it relates to other forms of prejudice. But first, according to data gathered by the Anti-Defamation League's Center on Extremism, between October 7th and the 23rd of 2023, there were 312 recorded incidents of anti-Semitism in the United States, which is an increase from 64 recorded incidents in 2022. 190 of those incidents, of the incidents this year, were directly related to the Israel-Hamas war, which was reignited on October 7th of this year. Likewise, the ADL found that anti-Semitic incidents have increased around the world, and chatter has grown particularly in white supremacist and right-wing channels in the days after the attack on Israel, all due to a perception some people have of a person's real or perceived support for the Jewish state. That is why we'll be addressing anti-Semitism in this interview. So, Rabbi Spector, thank you for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you here today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate being here.
No problem. Let's start at the very, very beginning. First of all, what exactly is anti Semitism and how has it manifested throughout the years?
Yeah, that's a great question because anti Semitism is can be a little tricky to define. And part of the reason for that is that Jews are an ethno religion. And other faiths, like, for instance, Lutheranism or uh, baptism, different strands of Christianity or Islam, are generally faiths. And then you also have ethnicities. And so we see forms of racism against uh, Black Americans, against Asian Americans, et cetera, et cetera. But Judaism is unique because it's an ethno religion. And so there's actually many different forms of anti Semitism, including ethnic, religious, economic, political, and also cultural anti Semitism, and what's called new anti Semitism, which often relates to how people perceive or treat Jews based off of their opinions towards Israel. And so there's many different components to what is anti-Semitism, but bottom line, anti-Semitism is a term that means hatred or bigotry or dislike against Jewish people and adherence to the Jewish faith.
It's called anti Semitism, but who exactly are the Semites? And how did the term come to be associated with the Jewish community?
That's a great question because Semites are uh, derived from a Western Asian group. And for instance, Arabic is a Semitic language. The Maltese language is a Semitic language. And so a lot of people say, maybe like, for instance, well, I'm Arab. How can I be anti Semitic? But the term anti Semitism is specific to Jewish people. And why that's the case, not quite sure, but it's actually a fairly new term in the last 100 years or so. I'd have to look up the exact year it was coined, but it is a term that is, even though uh, Semites is a fairly large umbrella of people, anti-Semitism is a term that is specifically under definitions used to describe bigotry against Jewish people.
What, maybe kind of on a superficial level, what would you say are some commonly held misconceptions about the Jewish community?
Sure. So within the Jewish community, we have a large diversity of viewpoints, and I think often folks think that uh, groups are monolithic. That's not the case at all with us. In fact, we are encouraged to argue, disagree with each other. In fact, Israel means uh, the God wrestlers. We are commanded to struggle. And so there's not really a Jewish point of view on anything. There's different Jewish perspectives on almost every situation out there. And so that that's the challenge, I think, that we often face. Uh, but also, again, a lot of times people don't realize that um, we are an ethno religion, and that leads to misconceptions. I think that there's misconceptions out there too about what it means to be a Zionist, and the amount of misconceptions I've heard in my life on what Zionism is has been astounding. Zionism is, like, the basic definition is the belief that the Jewish people have the right to self determination through independent statehood in their historic homeland. It doesn't really have anything to do with the Palestinians or about military or anything like that. And under the umbrella of Zionism, there are many different types of Zionisms that different people connect to that span the whole political spectrum. Uh, there's misconceptions that we are more loyal to Israel than the countries we live in, or that we um, are always lock in step with the Israeli government, and everybody always agrees with the Israeli government. That's certainly not true. And um, another misconception that I encounter quite often is the belief that all Jewish people are wealthy, um, and that is certainly not the case. Um, and also that all Jewish people are white. That's also very much not the case. In fact, I've often heard the Israeli-Palestinian conflict described as white people oppressing people of color. But if you go to Israel, you'll see that the majority of Israeli Jews are actually not white. So a lot of misconceptions, I think, out there.
Let's head to some information that I got from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, which is located in Washington, D.C. Um, they have a website with lots of information about the Jewish community in the United States, about the Holocaust, and according to them, prejudice against the Jewish community can be traced back to the times of early Christianity. Can you expand on the timeline of prejudice against Jews and the reason for that prejudice?
Well, I think that we can see in the Bible that there's been prejudice against Jews long before Christianity. And I apologize, by the way, to your listeners for my voice. I'm overcoming a winter flu here. Uh, but yeah, we see, in the story of the book of Esther, Haman saying that we should kill all the Jews, and also the oppression of Jews under Pharaoh in Egypt. In those cases, those were more racial incidences of folks who were saying, who were othering Jews. What we see with the rise of Christianity is a rise in religious anti Semitism. The reason for that is that prior to Christianity, most religions, aside from Judaism, were polytheistic, believed in many gods. And so, if you were an adherent to, let's say, the Greek religion, and you have thousands of gods, and you have one king god, Zeus, then if you meet a Jewish person who says, "Well, I just believe in one God, and it is the king god who rules over everything," okay, they're a follower of what I call Zeus, and that doesn't undermine my religion. With the rise of Christianity, though, and then later Islam, you have religions that are claiming to believe in the exact same God, as Judaism, but having things like we believe that God had a child and and was basically had the power of God incarnate on earth, and whoever believes in him will be granted eternal life. And the Jewish Bible affirms that is the truth, that this man Jesus was the Messiah. And then you get a Jewish person who says, that's not how I read the Hebrew Bible, and I don't believe that that's accurate. Now, all of a sudden, it wasn't like it was with the Greeks or any other group where we could say, okay, you have your beliefs, I have mine, but they don't conflict with each other. Now our beliefs are directly in conflict, where either Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of the God I believe in, or he's not. And if I'm saying he's not, I am politely or impolitely telling a Christian person, I believe your religion is wrong. And if they're saying he is, they are politely or impolitely telling me my religion is wrong and my belief is wrong. And people get touchy around that. And so you start to see a rise in religious anti Semitism. You then see accusations, and I could get into this or leave it for another time, of the Jews killing Jesus and the charge of deicide. You have anger at Jews for not accepting Jesus when a Christian person of that time might say, but it's so obvious that your Bible proves that Jesus is the Messiah, and a Jewish person saying, no, you're reading it wrong. That creates conflict. And then later on, and similar conflicts arose with Islam, not quite as intense until about the 20th century. Um, and then later on, you have situations where Christians are not allowed to do usury, the giving of loans and charging interest on them. Um, uh, that's forbidden in Christianity, but it was allowed in Judaism for Jews to do this for non-Jews. And so, if you wanted a loan, Jews also, by the way, weren't allowed to go into other professions. So they were pigeonholed into this profession. It's the only thing they could do. And for Christians who need loans, and probably most of us have taken a loan out at some point in time or another for a car, a house, a credit card debt, a student loan, something to that effect. Taking loans out pretty common. Um, if you needed a loan, really the only person you could get one from was a Jewish person. And then again, we probably all have this experience where when we start paying our loan company back and we're paying interest, we're like, those greedy people are taking my money and taking advantage of my situation. But then again, nobody would ever give you a loan without interest. And so um, you get this stereotype that develops of Jews being greedy and Jews being rich and conniving and things like this.
How did the early persecution of Jews expand beyond the religious realm and into the secular life?
Yeah, so great question. Uh, so, how persecution of Jews expand beyond religion and into secular life, aside from like the economic stuff I just mentioned, is as I've mentioned, Jews are an ethno religion. Jews are an ethnicity. Unfortunately, racism is a part of the world we live in and has been for a very long time in almost all corners of the world. We've seen even in places like India and Southeast Asia, Latin America, um, that uh, even among the communities there, people who are light skinned might be given preferable treatment or seen as a higher level of society than people with darker skin. Um, and maybe in other parts of the world, it's been the opposite. So, um, with that, for Jews, uh, I think in particular, uh, example of the racial anti-Semitism, the most notable one, of course, is the Holocaust. And uh, a lot of the Jews who were targeted in the Holocaust, of course, were very religious, but many of the Jews who were targeted in the Holocaust were just average looking people and were not religious at all. In fact, there were folks who were practicing Christians and maybe they had a Jewish parent or even a Jewish grandparent who they didn't know was Jewish, who were arrested and then sent to concentration camps. And where the racial component there came into play is um, folks like Hitler who believed in a pure Aryan DNA. Uh, they said, we can't necessarily tell who is Jewish on the street. And this is where they instituted the Nuremberg laws of 1935, where they started prohibiting Jews from marrying Aryans, from marrying German, pure German um, uh, uh, Europeans. And this wasn't so much even if the person was a practicing Christian. This was if they had Jewish ancestry. Um, and a few years ago, we had a shooting at a synagogue in Poway, California. And indeed, the shooter put in his manifesto the reason he was doing this was because you could no longer necessarily tell who was Jewish and who wasn't by walking down the street. And these people are now marrying our daughters and they are polluting our pure white DNA. And that's the rise you see in white supremacy of anti Semitism. Um, and Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, typically do have their own genetic makeup, but there's this idea that um, Jews are polluting uh, pure white DNA, and this is what also led to the creation of the Zionist movement. Theodore Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement, thought, you know, why don't we all just convert to Christianity? If we convert to Christianity, boom, no more anti-Semitism, problem solved. And he was a reporter and he was covering the Dreyfus affair in 1894 in Paris, France, where Alfred Dreyfus, an officer in the French military, career officer in the French military, had been accused of treason. It turned out he was later exonerated because the documents against him, it turned out, were forgeries by people who were anti-Semitic and didn't like that he was Jewish. But Herzl was covering the story as a journalist, and in a very humiliating, uh, in a very humiliating display, Dreyfus was marched out in front of thousands of people and had his medals ripped off of his chest, had his sword broken in half, and all this. And um, Herzl thought people would be shouting "Death to Dreyfus" and stuff like this, but they weren't. They were shouting "Death to the Jews! Death to the Jews!" And that's when Herzl went, wait a second, I'm in Paris, the most like educated, progressive city in the world at the time. And this man isn't Jewish. He's secular. He's French. He served his entire career in the French military and was a war hero for them. And he speaks French. He's as French as you can get. And yet they don't see him as a Frenchman, they see him as a Jew. And that's when Herzl said, it doesn't matter if we all convert to Christianity, it doesn't matter if we all give up our religion. Um, there's always going to be anti Semitism. And the solution is creating a state for the Jewish people where they can go and be safe and be able to live their lives.
There was a written work called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was published in Russia in the early 20th century. And that particular work makes a series of unsubstantiated and disproven claims about Jewish people, and the authors of this work remain unknown. Can you talk a little bit about it and what effect it had and how it came to be discovered as a forgery? I think that's important to say.
This, investigations have shown the Protocols Elders of Zion was created, I believe it was by Russian police officers who were anti Semitic in the early 20th century. Um, at that time, anti Semitism was horrific in the Russian Empire. That really stemmed from in the 1880s. The Tsar was assassinated, and he was actually a very beloved czar by the Jewish people. But one of the 13 conspirators who was arrested and executed for his assassination was Jewish. And even though there was, I believe it was 13 individuals who were convicted, and I think only one was Jewish, that made a lot of headlines where people started saying, um, the Jews are anti-Russian. The Jews are again othering the Jewish people, and you start to see wave after wave of pogroms throughout the 1880s, the 1890s, and the first decade of the 1900s. And between 1904, after some really horrific pogroms, and 1921, 1.9 million Jews immigrated from the Russian Empire in Eastern Europe to the United States, and others immigrated to other places, Britain, Canada, Palestine, etc. So, uh, what the Protocols of the Elders of Zion says is that it claims to be written by Jews and was discovered as a Jewish document that confirms a Jewish conspiracy to take over the world and to control all the world governments, all the world banks, all the world money, um, all the world wars, etc., etc. And it, of course, is preposterous, but um, you start to see it gain a lot of traction. In fact, even prominent Americans like Henry Ford, um, perhaps the most prominent American at the time, used his funds to personally publish thousands and thousands of copies of the Protocols of Elders of Zion and have them distributed throughout Michigan. Um, and I had the experience when I was in Thailand. I was backpacking through Thailand in my mid 20s, and I met a young, really nice man from South Africa, um, uh, and he was very excited to meet me. He didn't know any Jewish people, and he had a lot of questions. And one of his questions was, "Tell me about this bank fund and the money." And I was like, "What are you talking about?" He said, the Rothschilds." I said, what about the Rothschilds, who were the most prominent banking family in like the 19th century in Europe? I said, what do you mean? And he said, come on, I've read all about it, how there's a bank account that takes money from all over the world, and Jewish people can take from this bank account whenever they want. And that's why all Jews are wealthy. They control all the world banks and all the and I told him, I said, if that's true, I'm furious because nobody has told me about this. I've got none of this money. I have no clue what you're talking about. And he said, come on, it's in the protocols of the elders of Zion. I was like, oh, no, that is a complete forgery and an anti Semitic forgery that's not at all accurate. And so I explained that to him. And this was he had thought, and he was a nice guy, seemed intelligent, again in his 20s, um, very well spoken, that this was total truth. And sadly, if you go to many parts of the world, especially throughout the Arab world and other places, uh, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is still a best-selling book that you can find in bookstores.
Like any piece of misinformation or disinformation, despite it being debunked and completely disproven, like you said, many people still believe the claims made in it. And it's not just for members of the Jewish community, but for any segregated or targeted group in society that is attacked because of stereotypes, generalizations, and faulty or misleading information. Speaking strictly about the aforementioned anti Semitic propaganda, can you talk about why something like that has been so clearly and evidently disproven is still believed to be true and used against others?
I wish I had a good answer for you. I don't. I think that when times are difficult, we look to see who we can blame, who the other is. Um, that's where you see also not just anti-Semitism, but really bigotry against any group. And in Hitler's book Mein Kampf, that's what he talks about how the woes of Germany, and he lists all the uh, people who are responsible for the woes of Germany after the Versailles Treaty that ended World War One. Um, and he keeps referencing the international Jew. He never says who that is, but I think to a lot of people, um, we've seen that throughout history is that uh, the Jewish person is always the bad person. They are either um, to the poor, they're often seen as the wealthy, the rich, the elite. To the wealthy, the rich, the elite, they're often seen as the poor and the slum. To um, the far right, they are seen as the far left. To the far left, they're seen as the far right oppressors. Uh, and to white people, they're seen as another race, and that's masking as white, and again, polluting pure white DNA. And to people of color, they're seen as white elitist oppressors. Um, you see this throughout history in almost every place. I challenge you to name a single place in the entire world that has not where there's not been anti-Semitism. You can't find one. Um, so, uh, yeah, I don't have a good answer for why this stuff is available, why it's except that I think people unfortunately like to find somebody else to blame for their problems. That's why we're seeing anti Semitism on the rise, not just on the far right that I talked about, white supremacy. We're seeing a massive increase on the far left in our country and in Europe and throughout the world also of anti Semitism. It's really scary. It is coming from both ends and it's increasing. Um, so, yeah, I don't know. I think people just unfortunately, maybe it's human nature, like to have people to target, to discriminate, to blame for their problems.
You had mentioned that there was there's the attacks from the far right are pretty well documented. How are the attacks coming in from the far left?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, on the far right, we're seeing growing white supremacy. We're also in racial anti-Semitism. We're also seeing. There's some religious anti-Semitism too from the far right Christian from the Christian far right, and we are seeing um, you know increased conspiracy theories, things like Jewish space lasers, stuff like that. On the far left, what you're seeing is an emergence of economic anti Semitism, the idea that all Jews are wealthy, controlling the governments, things like that, but also new anti Semitism, holding Jews responsible for the actions of the state of Israel that people might disagree with, um, saying that Jews are more loyal to Israel than they are America, that Jews are oppressors, um, things of that nature. Just last week, we had somebody we had 4 hate crimes on our property last week, 3 bomb threats, and then somebody who drove through our parking lot screaming obscenities at people. The person who was driving through our parking lot screaming obscenities was, I suspect, a far leftist who, well, again, we're not the Israeli government. We're not the IDF. IDF does Israeli Defense Forces. They do not take their marching orders from me. Um, we are just American Jews. Now, most of us do support Israel, but we don't control the actions of the Israeli government, and we're not responsible for them. And this individual drove through our parking lot and screamed obscenities at people coming in and out of the synagogue because this individual was dissatisfied with the policies of the government of Israel. And likewise, this other one was not illegal, but we had a protester marching back and forth on the street outside of our synagogue demanding a ceasefire in Gaza. And this is somebody on the far left who felt it was appropriate to protest in front of their local synagogue because they disagreed with the policies of Israel.
We've been discussing the topic of, like, you've mentioned the word othering. Other people use the word scapegoating, which Wikipedia describes as, quote, the practice of singling out a person or group for unmerited blame and consequent negative treatment. And for just for our audience, an example of scapegoating is a team blaming a single player for why they lost when there were other factors involved that contributed to their loss. And of course, scapegoating is, like we've mentioned, is used on a larger scale socially when the ails of a society are blamed on a particular group. That way, like you mentioned, Rabbi, people have an enemy to act against, and like you've also mentioned, Hitler capitalized on that during the Second World War with anti-Jewish sentiment that had already existed. And we probably covered this already, but I want to ask just in case. In what other ways has scapegoating manifested itself in the 21st century, especially with regards to the Jewish community?
This is something we've seen throughout our lives and throughout my life. I'm 35 years old, um, and I grew up in Seattle. One of my memories as a young man, let's see, I was 18 at the time. Um, Seattle's a very liberal place. Uh, I kind of naively thought, oh, they won't have too much anti-Semitism there. Um, in 2006, uh, Israel was at war with Lebanon, and um, a man walked into the Jewish Federation of Seattle's building, Greater Seattle's building, um, and he shouted, uh, "I am a Muslim and I hate Israel." And then he opened fire and shot six people and killed one. The woman he killed, by the way, was somebody who had really dedicated her life to interfaith work. Um, and we've seen even, like, we know that Al Qaeda was responsible for 9/11. The amount of people, after Seattle, I went to UC San Diego for uh, undergrad, and um, there was a person who went through the library during finals week while I was there, and distributed DVDs to people that talked about how 9/11 was a Jewish conspiracy. Um, yeah, and with the worst anti-Semitic incident to happen on U.S. soil, the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh that killed 11 people in October 2018. Um, the reason the reason that the motive of the shooter was he was listening to far right media and heard about how there was a supposed caravan of millions of undocumented migrants going towards the southern border, preparing to invade the United States. And this far right media blamed George Soros and other Jews for funding this caravan. And as a result, um, uh, this man said basically the Jews are responsible for um, for what's happening on our southern border. and we're losing our country because of the Jews. We saw people blame Jews for COVID. In a very prominent example that happened right here in Utah, um, a, uh, a prominent business leader, um, not former business leader, uh, sent out a mass email. He was anti-vaccine. Sent out a mass email saying that the COVID vaccine was invented by Jews, um, and that we were telling our community not to get vaccinated uh, because the COVID vaccine contained in it a sterilization medication, and that Jews created this to basically ethnically cleanse the non Jewish world, and that Jews were not taking it, but telling everybody else to take it. That was right here in Utah, and by a very prominent leader. And so, and by the way, of course, that's ridiculous. And I'll just put out there that not only am I vaccinated from against COVID, we required vaccines to come into the synagogue when we reopened, and American Jews by um, a significant margin, nearly 20%, were more likely to be vaccinated than any other religious group in America against COVID. Um, so those are just some of the examples that come to my mind um, of scapegoating and anti-Semitism. But you see it in every single place. Unfortunately, when a Jewish person behaves poorly, Bernie Madoff, um, Jeffrey Epstein, Harvey Weinstein, or even in about 11, 12 years ago, a Jewish baseball player, Ryan Braun, won the National League Most Valuable Player Award. And this was a moment of big pride for Jews. It turned out later he had been cheating and using steroids. And whenever something like this happens, I, with dread, scroll down to the comments section on any news story because just the anti-Semitism there, um, and the about how Jews are the problem. Well, isn't it always Jews who are the sexual predators, Jews who are the pedophiles, Jews who are stealing the money, Jews who are cheating the system, et cetera, et cetera.
Is it possible to know why George Soros is a target, is a persistent target against, I mean, from conspiracy theorists?
Yeah, I don't really fully understand it. I'll be honest, I'm not an expert on George Soros. My understanding is that he is a left wing billionaire who, just like you have the Koch brothers on the uh, um, and on the right who use their billions of dollars to fund um, conservative organizations and politics. You have George Soros who does it on the left. However, what seems to often happen with George Soros is I feel like the context in which he's used is oftentimes they'll blame him for stuff that he maybe had nothing to do with. He's kind of the go-to. When I hear George Soros now, uh, I usually personally hear it as a dog whistle of, I can't say on far right wing media the Jews are responsible for this, but I can say George Soros. And you'll get the idea.
Another element of anti-Semitism is Holocaust denial. In a video from the U.S. U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, Dr. Deborah Lipstadt, who is an authority on anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial, and she also serves as a special envoy for monitoring and combating anti-Semitism here in the U.S. She discusses two types of Holocaust denial. The first type is what she calls hardcore Holocaust denial, where it flat out denies that any plan to exterminate Jews in Europe and beyond ever existed, despite all evidence which says otherwise. The second type she mentions does not deny that the Holocaust occurred, but that it was not as severe or as extensive as has been documented and evidenced. and she refers to that as softcore Holocaust denial. Can you expand on what Dr. Lipstadt talks about with regards to Holocaust denial? And how does the argument that the Holocaust itself, whether it's aspects of it or just the Holocaust, like I said, itself, were exaggerated or made up, fuel prejudice against Jewish people?
That's a great question. I think again we tap into the idea that Jews cannot be trusted, and that um, anything Jews do is for an ulterior motive for financial or political gain. And so there's an idea out there that this is my experience with the Holocaust denial is one, it's so hard to grasp the concept of the Holocaust. I'll be the first to admit that. Like we have let's type that we have about 3 million, a little more than that, people that live in the state of Utah. And over 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust. So imagine every single person in the state of Utah being killed over a period of 7 years, 6.5 years, really. And then another entire state of Utah, every single person being killed. Like it's unfathomable. Um, it's unfathomable. But there's so much evidence that this occurred. It's also undeniable. But I think there's an idea that you know Jews have uh, exaggerated or made up the Holocaust to garner world sympathy so that we can then use it for our own political gain, such as creating a state of Israel or something like this. Um, yeah, I mean, it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. But unfortunately, you see Holocaust denial happen today. And when I say Holocaust denial, I'm not referring to what happened, um, uh, 70, 80 years ago. Um, I'm referring to what happened 2 months ago, 10 weeks ago. Um, we have seen people say, I don't believe that what happened on October 7th actually happened. Uh, what has been extremely traumatizing is that on October 7th, there was mass rape and sexual assault of women by Hamas. And and people have said, I don't believe it. How do we know this happened? And in 2021, there were 120 um, gender studies departments in academics that condemned Israel for their war with Palestinian Islamic Jihad in Gaza. And none of them, to my knowledge, spoken out against the sexual violence against women on October 7th. And likewise, uh, there was one even leading academic, feminist academic, who said, "How do we know Israel's not making that up? How can we trust Israel?" And we thought the motto was "Believe women." We're now saying it's "Believe women unless they're Jewish." And what's been so traumatizing, and I've had congregants, women in my community, who are victims of sexual assault and rape, who have come to me for counseling in the last couple months because not only hearing about what occurred has re-traumatized them, but hearing how the world does not believe them or is not talking about the sexual violence or downplaying it, like you're with Congresswoman Jayapal, the leader of the Progressive Caucus on the far left, who represents my hometown of Seattle, Washington, who on CNN was saying, "Well, yeah, that's horrible, but let's talk about Gaza, what's happening in Gaza," and when it just unequivocally condemned this. You're having these women getting re-traumatized, and in Israel, you're seeing survivors of previous sexual assault, rape, their suicide numbers have increased since October 7th. And you've even seen prominent, charismatic, brilliant leaders like Queen Rania of Jordan call into question of how do we know what happened on October 7th actually occurred. And so what has Israel done? Israel and their consulates have taken video footage from that day and shown leaders and shown people who have come, who go there, and they watch the actual footage of what Hamas did. And where did this footage come from? It came from Hamas. They they had GoPro cameras on their head, and they filmed it. And what has been the response to that by many people throughout the world? Well, Israel is the leader in technology and AI. How do we know that they didn't just create this and make this up? So Holocaust denial seems unfathomable. But 10 weeks ago, we had the largest massacre of Jews in a single day since the Holocaust. And already, only 10 weeks out, we're seeing denial that it ever took place. And that, we made this up again for our own political and financial gain.
It seems like whether it's prompted or unprompted, and regardless of the abundance of documented and verified historical information that is out there, whether it's about the Jewish community or events that happened, and not just about the Jewish community, but other communities as well, there seems to be no shortage of things that trigger or set off hateful feelings towards uh, Jewish people or immigrants or Hispanics or blacks or anybody by some people. Given that, how can individuals, or how would you suggest individuals who face such vitriol navigate through it and keep themselves mentally healthy and protected?
Well, first of all, you know, have somebody you can talk to. Um, it has been extremely lonely to be Jewish for a long time. Really, every year since 2015, we've seen an increase to a record number each year of growth in anti Semitism. And it's scary. I have a therapist that I talk to about it. That's very helpful. But also, something else too, a couple other pieces of advice I have is, in the last 10 weeks, I've gotten death threats. We've had also four bomb threats at our synagogue. We have filed close to probably about a dozen police reports um, of hate crimes against our synagogue here in Salt Lake City. And it's really easy for me to focus on that. And I also have received hundreds of letters of people telling me who are not Jewish, telling me how they love us and support us. I've received, we had a nice guy who showed up here with LDS guy showed up with two boxes of C's candy and gave one to me, said, "You've had a tough time. I want you to have this." He gave a second one to me and said, "Give this to somebody in your community who's also having a tough time." And, you know, and we've had people, again, random people just send in donations knowing that we've had to cough up tons and tons of money for additional security here. When I say tons of money, I mean like $500,000. Um, and are donating to us so that we're not financially crippled. So it's really easy to focus on the people who hate us. If I take a step back and think about who loves us, who is showing love for us, like it's so much greater. There was again a LDS stake down the street from us reached out to me and said, I can't imagine the stress your community has right now. We want to make something, we want to take something off your plate. And they said, we will come and rake leaves for any of your congregants who need that. And about, 15, 16 congregants signed up for it. And they came and raked all their leaves and saved them a chore that they, and one less thing to think about. My final piece of advice, well, a couple pieces of advice. One, take breaks from social media. I think that and from some of this stuff, I've seen people all of a sudden make this their whole cause. Who say, I'm going to go to anti-Israel rallies to infiltrate and to spy on them and to, see what they're saying and to report. And I'm like, you're just causing yourself more mental deterioration right now. Or they're hunting for things on social media that's anti-Semitic to then try and combat it. I'm like, you're just going to, you know, drive yourself insane. A very final piece of advice is find your community. Um, for the people that love that, well, the people who hate Jews and want us to be um, eradicated, the best way you can do that is accept us and love us. Because when Jews feel accepted and loved, they go out into the world and they become less affiliated with Judaism. And that's a challenge we face. And when we're hated, when we're persecuted, I've seen our numbers increase so much over the last couple of months at the synagogue because people feel alone and they know the one place they can turn to is their Jewish community when they feel like the rest of the world hates them. So find your community and know that they're there for you.
Is there anything else you want to mention or discuss regarding anti Semitism or general prejudice that hasn't been discussed that maybe needs to be mentioned?
You know, one thing I'll add, I was going to mention, I forgot to, is that you asked me about like why this stuff is so prevalent and people look to be anti-Semitic. A book that just came out not too long ago, last couple of years, by a woman named Dara Horn, is called "People Love Dead Jews," and it talks about how the two most popular Jews um, in world history, at least of the past couple thousand years, who would you say, I'm curious, are the two most loved Jews in the last 2,000 years?
Jesus? And I don't know. Sorry, I don't know.
No, 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 it's all good. The second, so yeah, Jesus, and the second one, Anne Frank is what she said, and uh, everybody loves Anne Frank, and that's the thing is, she said, having Jews who are persecuted and victims and defenseless, that fits a narrative um, that is comfortable for folks. Having Jews who defend themselves and stand up for themselves, as any country would respond as Israel has, or and should respond as Israel has in the aftermath of October 7th. Look what our response was after 9/11, and that's any country would should and would respond that way. And we don't hear people saying to Hamas, stop embedding yourself within civilian populations. And also, we don't hear people saying, Hamas, you knew what the response from Israel was going to be to this, which they absolutely knew. And we don't hear people saying, Hamas, like demilitarize and release all the hostages, and all this will stop. What you're hearing time and again is how Israel is now committing genocide. Israel are the warmongers. Israel are the oppressors, and and how Israel, it's the responsibility is on Israel to do a unilateral ceasefire, but Hamas is continuing to say uh, what happened on October 7th will happen 1,000 more times under us. And so that's I say all this not to just promote a pro-Israel agenda, but rather to say, you know, I think what you see with Israel right now is something that's uncomfortable for much of the world, particularly the far left, because it doesn't fit their narrative of Jews being victims, and the concept that Dara Horn talks about in her book, People Love Dead Jews. The final thing I'll say is, uh, you know, speak out against anti-Semitism. We all need to speak out, whether it's racism, homophobia, Islamophobia. It's often the same people. Like that's what you see on the far right. People who hate us are the same people who hate Muslims and Black people, Asian people, et cetera, et cetera. But speak out against it. Reach out to your Jewish friends. Let them know you love them. Don't even ask how are you doing. I'll tell you they're doing terribly. Reach out and tell them you love them and that you're there for them, and support Jewish organizations too, because like I said, they do great work, but they're being bled dry because instead of paying their staff and for their um, programming different things, they're paying for increased security and police.
We've been talking to Rabbi Samuel Spector of the Congregation Kol Ami about the roots of anti Semitism and its relation to other forms of prejudice. Hopefully, today's discussion provided more insight into this pressing issue. So, I'd like to thank you, Rabbi, for taking the time to be here today and to share your knowledge and experience.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for this important conversation.